Hello and welcome. In this video, we will go through step by step how to answer the spending disadvantage as the affirmative. First, we'll review the parts of a disadvantage. Next, we'll walk through the three different trade-off scenarios that are in the disadvantage file and some good answers to each one of them. Lastly, we'll go through the mechanics of how to answer a disadvantage during a debate round. Let's review the parts of a disadvantage. As you know, there are three main pieces: the uniqueness, the link, and the impact. The uniqueness to any of these disadvantages will say that spending exists in a part of the budget now. The link will argue that new spending on education will trade off with other parts of the budget. And the impact will be that the trade-off has negative outcomes. In this file, there are three trade-off scenarios: one regarding the military, one regarding healthcare, and one regarding criminal justice. Before we go any further, I have an important piece of information to keep in mind. Regardless of which disadvantage they use against you, you only have to completely defeat one of the three parts of the disadvantage in order to make it go away. First, let's talk about the military spending disadvantage. The uniqueness argues that the United States is going to spend lots of money to fight ISIS and prepare missile defense against North Korea. But the affirmative has evidence to contest this part of the argument, saying that we spend obscene amounts of the military already. So why is there a trade-off? On the link debate, the negative will argue that new education spending will be reallocated away from the military budget. The affirmative can go for either a no-link or a link turn argument, saying first that there is no trade-off between education and the military. They could say that the trade-off is a good idea, and they can also play defense, saying that the affirmative isn't expensive, and even if there is a trade-off, it won't be big enough for anyone to care about. On the impact, the negative will say that ISIS is preparing to attack the United States now and that terrorism is bad. The affirmative can answer this argument in several ways. First, by saying that ISIS will lose now, regardless of more military spending, and that fighting terrorism could make the threat to the United States worse, not better. Next, let's talk about the healthcare spending disadvantage. First, the link. This is the best place to contest this scenario. They will say that new education spending will be reallocated away from the healthcare budget. The affirmative can argue that new investments in education can reduce healthcare costs and that the plan isn't very expensive. Otherwise, it's important to do some impact calculus about how your affirmative compares with the disadvantage. Next, let's talk about the criminal justice spending disadvantage. The uniqueness debate is that spending on prisons is increasing now because rehab programs are expensive. But the affirmative can argue that rehab programs are inevitable and that crime is unlikely to rise now. On the link debate, the negative will argue that spending on prisons and education programs trade off, often at the state level. These programs will be cut are rehabilitation programs that help inmates reintegrate into society, and that the plan action trades off with this existing spending. The affirmative can argue that this trade-off is not significant and won't happen, and that the plan isn't expensive. It's also important to remember to compare your impacts to that of the disadvantage using time frame, probability, and magnitude. Let's talk about how to answer a disadvantage throughout the debate. First, in the second affirmative constructive, the negative has shown their hand, and you know the main thesis of their argument for the rest of the debate. Providing an array of different answers on uniqueness, link, and impact gives yourself options later in the debate. Don't reveal which argument you believe is your strongest. Remember to avoid double turns, using only a link turn or an impact turn. You can start doing some basic impact calculus in this speech. In the first affirmative rebuttal, the negative just spent the entire block expanding on their position and trying to bury you in lots of arguments. They read lots of new evidence and added some link and/or impact scenarios. This is where it's important to remember you only have to take out one piece of the disadvantage in order to win. Focus where you are strongest, on the one or two parts of the disadvantage that are the weakest in the 1AR. Remember that link or impact turns can steal their advocacy for your side of the debate, but focusing on your strongest arguments is most important here because you have limited amounts of time. It's also important to not neglect impact calculus. In the 2AR, this is your last pitch to the judge, so make it count. You'll need to know what the negative is going for in the round, so focus on whatever their main points were from the second negative rebuttal. Provide a two-sentence overview. Why should we win the debate? Tell the story of the affirmative and how it interacts with the disadvantage. Answer any offense from the 2NR. Concentrate on one part of the disadvantage and why the affirmative has won that piece. Remember, once again, you only need to win one reason why the disadvantage doesn't work in order to defeat it, but you have to 100% win that argument. Lastly, do impact calculus between the affirmative and negative overall, including affirmative advantages. In the JV division, the thesis of negative arguments must remain predictable for the affirmative. That means you still have to argue against the education spending trade-offs with either the military, healthcare, or criminal justice spending. However, you can do new research to improve your arguments and add new scenarios. New uniqueness updates for the 2AC can help you keep your case up to date and will be especially effective against many of these spending trade-offs. New link evidence can show there isn't a trade-off or that a trade-off is a good idea. Lastly, new impact defense can answer their scenarios, and impact turns can help you capture their disadvantage.